Good morning, everyone. Many people are still joining us, but let's get started on time. Welcome. My name is Omri Ben Shachar. I am the director of the Coase-Sandor Institute at the University of Chicago Law School. And I'd like to welcome you to the second lecture in our Coase-Sandor Global Lecture Series. Before we introduce our moderator and speaker for today, let me just remind you that this is part of a series of lectures that are ongoing during the month of September, and that the next lecture will be later this week on Thursday, September 17, at this time, by Professor Lee Fennell, who will talk about coordinating behavior through law and norms with special reference to COVID-19 and climate change. Separately, we are holding a series of lectures organized with a Brazilian partner, the FGV University. And tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Chicago time, Professor Adam Chilton will deliver a lecture on the title, Do Constitutional Rights Matter? Again, all of these lectures are open, publicly open. You're welcome to join, and information about how to do that is available at the Coase-Sandor Institute website. Let's not wait any longer now, and we can start today's lecture. And to start it, I would like to invite Professor Haitian Lu, from the director of the Chinese Mainland Affairs Office at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University and the head of the Research Center on the Economic Sustainability and Entrepreneurship in Finance, a professor of law and finance in Hong Kong, who is a long-time friend of the University of Chicago Law School. As Professor Lu takes the podium and introduces our speaker, I would ask everyone at this time to mute their audio and turn off their video appearance. There will be time at the end of it, the second part of the lecture, for people to participate and appear on a video. Professor Lu, please.
Thank you, Omri, for the kind introduction. So as an alumni of Coase-Sandor Law and Economics Institute, it is my great pleasure to moderate this lecture on the most pressing and fascinating topic nowadays, patents, prices, and pandemics, by Professor Daniel Hemel of the University of Chicago Law School. So our speaker today, Professor Hemel, is a professor of law and Ronald Coase Research Scholar at University of Chicago Law School. He received a BA summa cum laude from Harvard, the MPhil with distinction from Oxford, and a JD from Yale Law School. Daniel's research spans taxation, administrative law, federal courts. His work appeared in major law reviews and has been cited by the US Supreme Court, as well as the Ninth Circuit and Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. His other writings have appeared in New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, Politico, Slate, Time Magazine, and Vox. So this talk is based on Professor Hemel's latest research on vaccine valuation. We all know this year is a challenge to all humankind. So far, the world's best chance to end this catastrophe is to have the safe and effective vaccine as early as possible. But when will this be available? What economic, legal, and political factors hamper its earlier release? And more importantly, how much should a vaccine worth? So to the extent that the COVID-19 is neither the first nor the last pandemic that we will face, what law and economic scholars can inform the public and private sector to be more prepared for the next pandemic? So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Professor Daniel Hemel.
Thanks very much, Haitian, and thank you, Omri, for this opportunity. One of the very few benefits of this pandemic has been that place almost doesn't matter anymore. So Haitian and I can interact even though we are 13 time zones apart, and we're all used to that. But place does still matter a little bit, so I am not standing in front of the University of Chicago Law School right now. I'm actually standing in my 2-year-old son's play area. And I imagine he will remain quiet for the remainder of the lecture. But my neighbor's dog has been interfering several times in the past. So if that happens, I apologize in advance. Today I will talk about patents, prizes, and pandemics, focusing particularly on the role of patent law in bringing about an end to this pandemic and preparing us better for the next one. Now, almost from the very start of the pandemic, there were concerns about patents interfering with the distribution of a vaccine, particularly with patient access to a vaccine. On March 27th, MSF, Doctors Without Borders, called for no patents on a COVID-19 vaccine. And it's not just activists. Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate economist, has made similar claims, seeing patents as an obstacle to patient access to the vaccine. The New Republic, a leading publication in the United States, has talked about breaking Big Pharma's monopoly on a COVID-19 vaccine. I will argue that the COVID-19 vaccine should cause us to rethink core assumptions about patent law. Patents on a COVID-19 vaccine are unlikely to generate deadweight loss that is typical of monopoly pricing. At the same time, patents on a COVID-19 on their own are unlikely to generate significant innovation incentives. Which isn't to say that patents on a COVID-19 vaccine don't matter at all, they do. But they matter for very different reasons than the reasons we generally think patents matter. The traditional view of patent law imagines a trade-off between incentives and access. Patents allow innovators to claim larger rewards, spurring additional investment in research and development. That's the dynamic efficiency benefit of patents, but there's a static efficiency cost. Patents cause consumers to pay above competitive prices, generating deadweight loss. There are individuals who value vaccines or value any patented product at greater than the marginal cost, but less than the monopoly price. I'm going to argue today that in the context of a COVID vaccine, the traditional view is wrong. Or if not wrong, it need not be right, and to the extent that it is right, that is only the product of poor policy choices. So for a moment, let's talk about the traditional view. The traditional view holds that knowledge is a quasi-public good. A public good we know is non-rival and non-excludable. My consumption of the good doesn't reduce its value to you, and I can't prevent you from consuming the good. Knowledge is a quasi-public good. It's non-rival. My having the knowledge doesn't reduce its value to Professor Liu, but it is excludable. And it's excludable through two mechanisms. One is secrecy, and another is law. Without the legal technology of exclusion, the quasi-public good character of knowledge would lead either to excessive investment in secrecy. I wouldn't want to reveal my knowledge to you because I want to be able to profit from it, or insufficient investment in knowledge production being innovation. Patents provide a legal technology of exclusion to discourage excessive investment in secrecy while encouraging greater investment in innovation. Patent law provides innovators with a time-limited right to exclude others from using their knowledge. And this in turn allows patent holders to charge prices that are above the competitive price. This is the innovation incentive benefit of patents. But it comes under the traditional view at an access cost. So the traditional view of patents posits that the cost of exclusion, the social cost of exclusion, is deadweight loss. In a pure competition model, we have price set at the point where demand meets marginal costs. But when the patent holder exerts market power over the patented technology, the patent holder can charge the profit maximizing price, which is greater than marginal cost, increases producer surplus, but at the cost of deadweight loss, that familiar harbinger deadweight loss triangle that those of us who have taken economics have seen. That deadweight loss being the loss from all the people who would be willing to pay the competitive price, but are unable or unwilling to pay the monopoly price. The traditional view conceives of patent law as a balancing act between incentives and access. The stronger patent rights are, the stronger the incentives for innovation, but the greater the cost and the limits on access. So what's wrong with the traditional view in the context of a COVID-19 vaccine? Well, in the context of a COVID-19 vaccine, we're very likely to see the government buy up almost all, if not all, of the production. So the US government has already committed to buy 250 million doses of its COVID-19 vaccine from Moderna. This is an announcement of the first 100 million dose purchase, plus another 250 million doses of a similar vaccine from Pfizer, right, which is already more than the US population, and additional amounts from other firms. And the COVAX facility, run by the WHO, has brought together rich world countries to also buy up vaccines before they're even produced. So we have not quite a monopsony here, but we have a small number of buyers, and those buyers are governments. What are the implications of government purchases for our view of patents? Well, in the US, there's no right to exclude vis-a-vis the federal government. The federal government can take your patent, and all it has to do is pay you reasonable and entire compensation. You cannot enjoin the government from using your patents. And there are versions of 28 USC 1498, this government patent use statute, in many other countries as well. Now, government patent use laws vary significantly across countries. We have participants from dozens of countries here. I'm interested to hear more about your legal system's restrictions on government patent use. But as a general matter across the world, it is hard to enjoin the government. And we have extraordinary buyer market power here, limiting the ability of patent holders to set the price. So if Moderna, which is this company in Cambridge, Massachusetts that's developing a messenger RNA vaccine, were to not sell to the US government, it's not entirely clear who it would sell to. It relies on the US government both for access to the US market, because the US government controls who has access to the US market, and for the technological capacity to ramp up its production to hundreds of millions of doses. So the traditional view holds that we give patent holders a right to exclude, allowing them to charge above competitive prices. But that's largely wrong in this context. Right? The primary purchaser is the government, against whom there is no right to exclude, and prices will be set in negotiation with the government. But the monopolist's power is counterbalanced by the monopsonist's power. The monopolist, the patent holder, does not have the sole capacity to set price. Additionally, it is very likely that vaccines will be distributed at no cost to patients in the United States. And it is looking like this will be similarly true in other countries. The Trump administration has promised that the vaccine will be available to the American people at no cost, other than whatever cost is paid to the frontline healthcare workers who are administering the vaccine. Right? But I won't be paying Moderna or Pfizer. I won't be paying the vaccine manufacturers. The government is covering that. Some have even talked about paying people to take vaccines, which I think makes a lot of sense. It would set the price not at zero, but at negative. And the idea is getting vaccinated generates a large positive externality. We shouldn't charge people for that. We should pay them for that. Well, the traditional view of patent law holds that there's a static inefficiency because consumers have to pay above competitive prices. That's what generates the deadweight loss. But it seems as though in this context, consumers aren't going to pay above competitive prices. They're going to pay no prices or even negative prices. So we don't have the dynamic efficiency benefit of patent law here, at least in its traditional form, nor do we have the traditional static inefficiency. So is there a balancing act here? Now, one might think that when we have government purchasing, instead of the deadweight loss of monopoly, we have the deadweight loss of taxation. So the traditional view doesn't quite get it right, but it's still a balancing act between incentives and a form of deadweight loss. It's just that the traditional view misdescribes the deadweight loss as a deadweight loss of monopoly pricing, but it's still a lot like a deadweight loss. Again, familiar for those who have taken introductory economics courses. When we have a tax, the tax raises the price to the consumer above marginal cost. That leads to instances in which the buyer would buy the product without taxes, but doesn't with the taxes. That lost social value is deadweight loss. And in the context of an income tax, the primary market in which we see this will be the labor market. But that turns out not to be quite right either. So an important, and I think underappreciated result in public finance is that the deadweight loss of taxation is not a cost of the government supplying public or quasi-public goods. Paul Samuelson, the Nobel laureate, articulated this view in 1954. People forgot about it for a while, and it's been resuscitated in more recent decades. Why not? Right? We know that there's a deadweight loss of taxation. So in thinking about the government raising revenue from consumers to buy public or quasi-public goods, why shouldn't we think of the deadweight loss of taxation as a cost? Well, here's one way of framing the Samuelson insight. The deadweight loss of a lump sum tax is zero. By that I mean if the government could tax everyone $1 to supply a good that everyone values at $1.01. There'd be no deadweight loss. Everyone would be 1 cent better off. No one should work any less, other than perhaps a very small income effect, because now they've got an extra 1 cent of value. In the lump sum tax, the tax isn't based on your behavior. So if we were funding the public good or the quasi-public good through a lump sum tax, most of us agree that we wouldn't take the deadweight loss of taxation into account, because there's not a deadweight loss of taxation. A deadweight loss of taxation arises when taxes redistribute on the basis of behavior. So income earning or consumption. Why do we do that? Right? We tax on the basis of behavior. We tax on, for example, income, because we prefer the distributive implications of behavior-based taxes over lump sum taxes. If taxes are lump sum, the government should spend $1 per person to generate a good valued at $1.01 without consideration of deadweight loss. And if taxes are preferable to lump sum, then the government should still spend $1 per person to generate a good valued at $1.01 without consideration of deadweight loss. Why is it that when instead of funding public goods through the lump sum tax, we're funding public goods through a tax that we like more than the lump sum tax? Why, under those circumstances, would our prescription change? So this leads to a puzzle. If patents on a COVID-19 vaccine do not implicate the traditional incentives axis trade-off, then what exactly do patents on a COVID-19 vaccine do? And how should we reward COVID-19 vaccine developers? I'm going to answer these questions in reverse order, or try to answer these questions. I'll be aided by Professor Liu's remarks and your comments in Q&A. First, we'll talk about how we should reward vaccine developers, and then what role patents play in this process. So how should we reward COVID-19 vaccine developers? First, this is largely a question for the next pandemic, not for this one. Why? Well, we're quite far along in the development of a COVID-19 vaccine. The first phase 3 coronavirus vaccine trial in the United States began at the very end of July. And others have begun since then. We don't have a vaccine yet. One reason why we don't have a vaccine is that a phase 3 trial takes some time. The leading vaccine candidates both require 2 doses that are 28 days apart. So you wouldn't be able to do a phase 3 trial in less than 28 days. And it takes some time to get people into the trial, and you want to observe them for some period after the second dose. So it's implausible, it's not implausible, it is unlikely that the reward that we offer now is going to significantly affect the time to arrival of the vaccine in this pandemic. At this stage, it is quite unlikely that Moderna, after a significant sunk cost, is going to say, the reward's not enough, we're going to call it all off. This is largely a question for the next pandemic. And there will be a next pandemic. I can't tell you what the next pandemic will be. It could be monkeypox, it could be the Nipah virus, it could be a drug-resistant malaria. But it's been more than 100 years since the last pandemic of a scale of this one. There's no reason to think that we have 100 years before the next one. It could be 100 years, it could be 5. An increasingly interconnected world will see the spread of disease occur more quickly. Our goal is to induce private sector firms to invest optimally in vaccine development before the next pandemic arrives. That's the social objective. We want investments both in platforms. So messenger RNA vaccine technology is a platform. Adenovirus vaccine technology is a platform. Once you have the platform up and running, you can calibrate the platform toward a particular vaccine. So investments in mRNA technology help us for the next pandemic, even before we know what the next pandemic will be. And we also want investment in vaccines for emerging infectious diseases. Right? Diseases which exist, the Nipah virus exists. It hasn't become a pandemic yet, but it could. The key words here are invest optimally. Well, what does it mean to invest optimally, and how would we get private sector firms to do so? One proposal associated with a bunch of scholars, but one is Amy Kapczynski at Yale Law School, who's written eloquently and articulately on this subject, and various co-authors, is for a cost plus reasonable profit reward. So the idea would be Moderna, this mRNA vaccine developer in the United States, has spent about $1.6 billion out of pocket so far. By out of pocket, I mean from capital raised by shareholders. It's gotten a little bit of federal funding, a few tens of millions of dollars, but most of the money has come from shareholders, from the private sector. Cost plus profit recovery would say, well, we'll take that $1.6 billion and we'll add on top of it some reasonable rate of return. Might be 7%, might be 10%. And that will determine the reward, right? So it will ensure that vaccine developers make a profit. If you don't like 7%, choose 14%, choose 20%, but use as your starting point the vaccine developer's investment. And as long as we commit to cost plus reasonable profit recovery, a reward of that size, then vaccine production will be profitable. That's the idea. What are the problems of cost plus reasonable profit? Well, one is it's heads we tie, tails you lose. For every Moderna, there will be a firm that invests in a platform technology that fails, or a firm that invests in a disease-specific vaccine for a disease that does not emerge. So best case scenario, Moderna does as well as it would have done investing in a stock portfolio. And worst case scenario, it loses its investment. Why would it invest under those circumstances? Now, advocates of cost plus reasonable profit recovery are alive to this problem, and they say, well, one way that we could address that is increasing Moderna's reward by the risk that it's taken on. So if we could measure what its ex-ante risk was, what its ex-ante probability of succeeding was, then we could tie the reward to that. A challenge there, though, even if we get that right, is there's no particular incentive to invest in big problems. Right? We would be providing the same reward regardless of whether you develop a vaccine for COVID-19 or for Western equine encephalomyelitis virus. And if you haven't heard of Western equine encephalomyelitis virus, that's probably leaves you no worse for the wear. It's been around in the United States for several decades. It's killed some dozens of people. It doesn't have pandemic potential. It's in horses in the western part of our country and occasionally jumps over to humans, but doesn't seem either particularly fatal or particularly infectious. But if our reward is keyed to your expenditure, then it doesn't matter what you spend on. All that matters is how much you spend. An alternative to cost plus reasonable profit recovery is value-based pricing. So in the United States, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review has been the developer of a framework for value-based pricing. And the basic idea is to multiply quality-adjusted life years, or QALYs, saved by a vaccine or other pharmaceutical product by the monetary value of a QALY. So you can plug in different values for a QALY. The most commonly used one in the United States is between 100,000 and 150,000. ICER has suggested 50,000 in the context of a COVID-19 vaccine. I'll spare you the weeds of ICER models. I think that 50,000 QALY valuation is a mistake, but if we use it as an example, what it would mean is if you save the life of a healthy person, or if you save 1 year of the life of a healthy person, that is worth 50,000. And saving a year of life is valued less as that quality of the year of life degrades. And this way, we can also compare longevity benefits against other health improvements. Now, my frequent co-author, Lisa Larimore-Wallet at Stanford, with whom most of my work on this subject is based, have tried to reconstruct the ICER model of COVID-19 vaccine value. And if you're curious, you can go to bit.ly/vaccine value and see our model there. And we estimate that with a $50,000 value for a QALY and other assumptions consistent with ICER's approach, you would get a value of a vaccine around $500 per person. So vaccinating 65% of the US population would cost about $100 billion. Now, I should pause and say $500 per person is way more than the US has committed to pay Pfizer or Moderna so far. The US is committed to paying those companies all in about $40 per vaccine. So if we use a low-end estimate for the value of a QALY, this would suggest that current rewards are significantly undercompensatory. And one reason why we think that we're doing this model right is Moderna, in one of its releases to investors, said, we're not quite sure how a vaccine will be valued, but if we were to use the ICER model and plug in a $50,000 value of a QALY, we think you would get a reward of about $500 per vaccine. So we feel pretty confident that at least we're thinking about this the same way that they are. Now, the logic of value-based pricing is that investment is profitable under the QALY framework when the probability of success times social value is greater than the cost. And those are precisely the circumstances in which investment is socially optimal. So if you're correctly calculating social value, you align the vaccine developers' incentives with society's incentives. What are the problems of value-based pricing? The most frequently cited concern is that it's too expensive. I want to suggest that this should be a non-concern. If we were to use the $50,000 value for equality, that would mean that the United States would be spending about $100 billion to vaccinate its population. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that our deficit expands by about $10 billion for each day of the COVID-19 pandemic. And actually, if you compare the amount that the United States has committed to Moderna for its entire run of vaccines against the cost to the federal deficit of the pandemic, it's about 20 hours, right? So if the reward that we're giving Moderna means that a vaccine arrives 20 hours earlier, it pays for itself. In a country with $100 trillion of household wealth, $20 trillion of GDP, and about $5 trillion of government spending, $100 billion to end the greatest pandemic in a century is a steal. I think expense is not the obstacle to value-based pricing. A second and more serious obstacle to value-based pricing is the challenge of cumulative innovation. So Isaac Newton famously said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And a wonderful thing about this quote, as Robert Merton showed in a book on this particular line, is that Newton was not the first person who said this. In fact, Newton was building on similar quotes from others. But if we all stand on the shoulders of giants, we might worry that rewarding, hypothetically, Moderna based on the social value of a COVID-19 vaccine overcompensates Moderna for the work of previous innovators, right? Because it would be capturing the entire social value of a vaccine. But some of that work comes not from Moderna, but from people earlier in the chain, from Watson and Crick and Franklin, or from Darwin, or from Hooke. On the other hand, rewarding Moderna based on the social value of a COVID-19 vaccine undercompensates Moderna for the benefits to subsequent innovators who make use of Moderna's insights. Right? So we all stand on the shoulders of giants, but then giants stand on the shoulders of us. Now, there's no assurance that the overcompensation and the undercompensation will balance out. The key point here is that the challenge of cumulative innovation and how to price it in doesn't lead to systematic overcompensation or undercompensation. It potentially leads to both. So I'm going to bracket the challenge of cumulative innovation here. Ideally, the overcompensation and undercompensation would balance out. It would be magical if that occurred perfectly. We might assume that it occurs at least roughly. A third problem is racing. What do I mean by racing? Well, imagine hypothetically that Moderna and Pfizer are competing to produce a vaccine, as in the United States they are. And let's say the social value of a vaccine is $100 billion. And let's say Pfizer will have the vaccine ready by Tuesday. Moderna would be willing to spend $99 billion to have the vaccine ready by Monday, right? Because then it gets the whole $100 billion reward. This is the problem of a winner-takes-all system. Each potential innovator, in considering its investment, isn't asking how much does my investment add to social value. It's asking how much does my investment add to my probability of capturing the social value. And this is a real problem, I think, with value-based pricing, that it potentially over-incentivizes innovation by generating races. But I'm going to suggest that it's actually less of a problem in the COVID-19 vaccine context, and probably in the pandemic context more generally. For one, the race is likely to have multiple winners. There's probably not going to be just one vaccine in the United States. or one vaccine globally, because scaling production is going to take a while, and that allows multiple pharmaceutical companies to get to the finish line and claim a portion of the reward. Demand is likely to far exceed supply, at least for a while. It's going to take us a long time to vaccinate the world's population. Right? So India, for example, has at great cost ramped up its vaccine production capacity so that it can produce up to 360 million courses per year. That's a phenomenal feat for India if that actually pans out. It would take them 3 years to vaccinate their entire population. This is somewhat of a detour from our discussion of patents in the pandemic, but close to the discussion of vaccines. We are likely soon going to enter a period in which our populations are being gradually vaccinated, right? And we have to imagine what the half-vaxxed society looks like. Right? We know what the entirely vaccinated society looks like. We know what the unvaccinated society looks like. But what is going to a baseball game look like when half of the people have the COVID-19 vaccine and the other half don't? What do restaurants look like? What do our classrooms look like? And finally, time is of the essence. Getting the vaccine here Monday rather than Tuesday might not matter that much, but getting the vaccine here in October rather than in January really does. So to the extent that value-based pricing induces racing, it's less clear that value-based pricing is a problem. So I've made the case, it's a somewhat uneasy case, but I think stronger than the alternatives, for value-based pricing for a COVID-19 vaccine. I haven't said anything about patents yet. What exactly do patents on a COVID-19 vaccine do? Well, recall, typically patents provide a right to exclude, allowing the patent holder to charge above competitive prices. But here, the patent holder has no right to exclude vis-a-vis the government, and it has limited pricing power in the face of monopsony or oligopsony, in the face of a small number of buyers, primarily governments, and an even smaller number of buyers because most of the rich world governments outside the United States have banded together into a buyer cartel. Benjamin Royne, in an important 2014 article in the University of Chicago Law Review, saw this problem coming, and he said, well, a patent protects the holder against government expropriation by allowing the patent holder to reject the government's offer and sell on the open market. So even when the patent holder is ultimately selling to a government purchaser, as is the case not only for the COVID-19 vaccine, but for countries with single-payer health insurance, even though it is quite likely that the ultimate purchaser will be the government, the patent gives the innovator the option of rejecting the government's offer, gives the patent holder a bargaining chip. But while that may be true in other contexts, it's limitedly so in the COVID-19 vaccine context, because access to the market is itself controlled by the government. Spurning government's offers and selling direct to the market is not a live option for Moderna or Pfizer. One, it's not clear that the FDA would even let them do this, that the Food and Drug Administration in the United States would even let them do this. And two, it's not clear that they can distribute to a large market without significant government assistance. I'm going to propose that what a patent does in this context is it gives its holder the benefit of liability rule protection against government expropriation. By liability rule protection, I mean that a court will be determining damages. Recall, in the US and in other countries, there are similar statutes. If the government infringes upon your patent, you have the right to go to court and demand reasonable and entire compensation. And that exists here. Either way, the reward is going to be determined by the government. But what a patent does is it gives the holder the option for the reward to be determined by a different branch of government, by the courts, rather than by the health ministry, or in the United States, the Department of Health and Human Services, the buyer of the vaccine. And that shadow of the court is likely to affect negotiations between the patent holder and the buyer. So in a vaccine context, or in a pandemic vaccine context, a patent is a court-enforced commitment by the government to provide innovators with a prize, after which we have distribution at marginal costs, no cost at all, or even negative costs. What are the implications of this view? Well, one, the primary reason why we should care about the reward for the COVID-19 vaccine is that it is likely to invest technologies to address future pandemics. We're having this debate in the COVID-19 context, but we're really having the debate about pandemic influenza or the Nipah virus or drug-resistant malaria. The policy challenge is not to balance incentives and access. They're not in conflict, but to calibrate the reward so that it equals the social value of the innovator's contribution. This is not an easy challenge, but it is a fundamentally different challenge than what the traditional view of patents takes to be the central trade-off. So government purchases, not just in the COVID-19 context, but in any government context, if the United States went to Medicare for all, or in many countries with single-payer health insurance, the incentives access trade-off can be avoided by government purchasing. But instead of incentives versus access, we face a trade-off between underinvestment and racing. And in that context, the patent ceases to serve as a right to exclude, but it becomes an option to have a court determine the size of the prize. Now, finally, I want to talk briefly about alternatives to this patent-backed prize structure that I've described. One is, we could have research in vaccine technology funded ex ante by the government. And in the United States, we do. We have the National Institutes of Health. We have grants to universities like the University of Chicago for vaccine research. The challenge is, how do we sustain these investments in non-pandemic times? So in the United States, we know that hurricanes are coming this year. They come every year. We systematically underinvest in hurricane preparedness. And then when a hurricane comes in, we pour a huge amount of money into cleaning it up. But we know that they're coming next August or September. And if we're that unable to sustain preparedness investments in the context of an annual and easy to imagine risk, it's ambitious to think that we'll be able to do it with respect to more difficult to imagine future pandemics. Hopefully we'll be able to do it, but I'm less than confident. We could also enact research and development tax credits aimed at pandemics. In the United States, we have something called the Orphan Drug Act of 1983, which provides tax credits to pharmaceutical companies that invest in products that treat rare diseases. Diseases that affect only a few thousand or tens of thousands of people. We can imagine a pandemic drug act of 2021 doing the same. But it's difficult to imagine ex-ante investment on its own leading to a socially optimal level. So to wrap up, how we reward COVID-19 vaccines will have potentially important implications for the next pandemic. Unless we can sustain political support for public sector development in vaccine platforms and disease-specific vaccines, the challenge will be how to credibly commit to large rewards. There's an advantage, I think, of value-based rewards over cost-based rewards. Value-based rewards still lead to difficult problems of computation and to the trade-off of racing. But we've erred so far on the side of underinvestment that the risk of overinvestment now doesn't keep us up at night. And an important function of patents here is to provide a judicial floor on the size of the prize. It's not a right to exclude. It's not a guarantee of above marginal cost pricing, of above competitive pricing, but it gives the patent holder an option of invoking an alternative government branch in its pursuit of a prize. So with that, I look forward to Professor Liu's comments and to your questions and thoughts.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank Professor Hemel for this eyes-widening presentation. Actually, we know that the vaccine technology is a textbook example of public good. So every day, actually, the COVID-19 is adding 10 billion US dollar to the fiscal deficit in the United States, and not to mention the social welfare losses. So the fact that the governments are purchasing the vaccines from the large pharmaceuticals and then provide those vaccines for free to their citizens actually challenge the traditional view of the IP, especially the patent law. So I think that your research has enlightened us in viewing the incentive mechanism and allocation mechanisms of innovations separately. So we know that the pharmaceutical profits and public health are not incompatible. And moreover, I think it broadens our horizon on the policy tools available for ex-ante and ex-post rewards to innovation, including price, tax credits, and public-private partnership. So I will welcome the audience to raise more questions, but I can take the privilege of the moderator to ask the first question. So my question is simple. It is on the vaccine nationalism. So we know that the big countries like US, China, Russia are busy approving its own vaccines. And on the other hand, the smaller economies like Hong Kong's are busy pre-ordering vaccines from external sources. So what about those poor countries who cannot afford? And then I think this is a global issue and we cannot ban the international travel indefinitely. So what's your comments on that?
Great, thanks. So concerns about vaccine nationalism figure prominently into discussions of rewards and distribution. The idea is that one country will take up the global supply of vaccines itself. We are likely to see that, right? We are likely to see Moderna and Pfizer distribute to the US and possibly to the EU first. From a global social welfare perspective, is that optimal? Probably not. We do have older populations, which might give us some priority over other countries, but probably not to the extent that government policy will reflect. I'll make 3 points about this. One is that it's not clear that the globally optimal allocation is an even across all countries allocation. And the reason is that the vaccine is unlikely to be 100% effective, right? So if you have a vaccine that's, we know this from the influenza vaccine, from the seasonal influenza vaccine context. If everyone is vaccinated, or if a significant portion of your country is vaccinated, then you can stop transmission, right? Yeah. But if you're protected by a vaccine that's 60% effective, right, you still might get the vaccine, right? And it will take us a while in order to achieve herd immunity. So we might want some uneven allocation across countries, not because we don't value lives everywhere equally, but because we can actually protect more people by concentrating the vaccine in particular locations initially. Second, I derive some solace from the last point you made, that it will not be in the rich world's interest to vaccinate only the rich world. Because countries like China and Hong Kong and the United States and the EU, they depend on international travel, right? And if the vaccine isn't perfectly effective, right, so their own population remains vulnerable to the virus, right, if they encounter people who are infected, well, then we can't really have international travel without global vaccination. Or if we do, it will lead to occasional reseeding, i.e. to seed again in the United States. And even in a herd immunity context, we'll have some people infected before the virus dies out, right? So if we really want to end COVID-19, we're going to need to have global vaccination. So it will be in the rich world's interests to ensure that vaccines don't stop at their own borders. And lastly, and I'd say the last point is that, look, we know that there are huge global welfare gains from the distribution of healthcare resources from the rich world to the rest of the world, right? Ideally, we would see that not just for the COVID-19 vaccine, but for all sorts of diseases that continue to kill people in low-income countries, even though we've known for decades or centuries how to deal with them in the United States or in Hong Kong. Right? It seems to me somewhat utopian to believe that in the COVID-19 vaccine context, we're going to see global altruism. We're going to see the United States putting its population behind, members of its population behind the rest of the world, when we've been so unwilling to eradicate diseases like tuberculosis everywhere. So I think some vaccine nationalism is probably, which isn't to endorse it, it is probably inevitable. I think it's orthogonal to the question of how much we should reward vaccine developers, but I don't want to minimize the concern.
Thank you. Thank you. Fully agree. So for the audience, if you have a question, you can raise your hands so I can see you, and then I will move the mic to you. May I take this opportunity to ask a second question about exactly on the pricing of the vaccine? So we know that it is, as you mentioned in your lecture, so it's inevitable that the government will be involved in the pricing of the vaccine. So not only because it is the largest purchaser, but also it has the largest distribution channel. So however, we know that the government assessing the value of an innovation is always a pain point. So in every country's innovation system, so even the government adopts a expert peer review system, but still we feel something is uneasy. So how can we improve the ex-ante reward to motivate our professors, scientists on one hand, and also to encourage more private investment into selected projects on the other?
It's a great question. In the COVID-19 vaccine context, we can't just say, well, let's look at the price generated by the market. Because there's not really a market, and if there were a market, the market price wouldn't be the socially optimal price, because without some sort of subsidy, people wouldn't take into account the positive externalities. So we don't really have an alternative, I don't think, to government valuation. One approach is to bring in courts. And that's implicitly what 28 U.S.C. 1498 in the United States does, what government patent use statutes do. It would be great if we could have an administrative agency of economists and public health scholars who applied value-based pricing models and rewarded in the government purchasing context on that basis. But I think as important is that what we actually do in this context will be a strong signal of what we'll do in the next one.
Indeed, yeah. Thank you. So, okay, so I can see there are some comments from the audience. So who is raising your hand right now? Let's see. Okay, can I call the Yongjian, please? Can I give the mic to Yongjian? Yeah.
Hi, Daniel. Good to see you virtually. So my question is about compulsory licensing. So it is like, you don't have to, like the US government doesn't have to buy from Moderna and Pfizer to get the vaccine. It could like licensing other firms to use Moderna's or Pfizer's patent to make the drugs. How would that change the dynamics? And then moving forward, whether your colleague Eric Posner and Glenn Weil's idea of radical markets, having a Harberger tax on patents for patent holders who keep their patents, but they use their self-revealing price as the basis for either compensation in this pandemic time or for compulsory licensing prices. How do you think that would work? Because we don't tax patent holders or copyright holders for holding it. But I think Chevelle, some 2 decades ago, have similar proposal about copyright, but why not patent? Thanks.
Great, so those are both wonderful questions and great to see you. So in the first context, why doesn't the US it could buy up a license from Moderna and Pfizer and then let other people manufacture, or it could force Moderna and Pfizer to give it a license through compulsory licensing, and then allow other manufacturers to produce the vaccine. I think the answer in this specific context is that manufacturing a vaccine is really hard. And the expertise doesn't exist at generic manufacturers in the same way that it would for Advil, right? Additionally, one of the rate limiting factors is supply chains. So it's not clear that you actually want to give the license to 10 people who are all going to be buying up from the same supplier of raw material, which is likely overseas. But by just giving free licenses, it's not obvious that we would actually get more of the vaccine. And there would be some negative externalities from open licensing. We saw this in the polio context. In 1954, when Salk developed his vaccine, the United States licensed 8 manufacturers to make the live virus to make the killed virus vaccine, to make the vaccine that Salk had developed. One of them screwed up the production process and infected hundreds of kids in Idaho with polio. Now, this doesn't mean that vaccines are generally dangerous, but it is a difficult manufacturing process, right? And you want to limit who has the ability to do that. And I think there's reason to believe that the firms that played the leading role in development have some advantage vis-a-vis the rest of the private sector in manufacture. Not always the case. It may turn out to be that we could manufacture more, faster, safer if we gave Moderna's license to someone else. But then you get into the question, well, maybe Moderna will find that other firm and collaborate with them. And we've seen that in both the Moderna context and in the Pfizer context. Pfizer didn't develop this vaccine. BioNTech in Germany played the major role in developing the vaccine, and it realized that Pfizer had vaccine manufacturing specific human capital that would make it better at scaling up than BioNTech would be. Now, the key problem, the Posner and Weil idea for essentially self-assessed valuation, I think it works well in the land context. And Posner and Weil acknowledge that their brilliant mechanism, which derives from earlier work by Harbinger, from Vickery, both Saul Levmore and Lee Fennell here at the University of Chicago have written about this as well. The one big problem is incentives. If you're really correctly pricing the good, whether it's a copyright or a patent or a piece of land, then that means the more you invest, the more you pay in this Harbinger tax. And that's the big problem in the knowledge context. In the knowledge context, we want to incentivize investment, right? The Vickery mechanism or the Posner-Weil mechanism works best in the context of land, where we think that value is largely outside of the control of the owner. Right? But here we're talking about a context in which value is entirely within the control of the owner.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so the next I'll give the mic to Matt Inglow. Yeah.
Good morning, Daniel. Long time no see. It's been too long. So I'm really glad that you talked briefly about quality, because my question is also about quality. Recently, we've seen some public trust be undermined in terms of the FDA and its ability to accurately report information, or perhaps in the context of a vaccine, accurately and reliably ensure that a vaccine is safe through the trial process. Do you think there's any concern that different reward structures could affect the quality or safety of a vaccine? And if so, how do the different structures impact this?
Yeah, I think there's some reason to believe that in a context in which Americans don't fully trust their government, that private sector development can play a salutary role. I think there are a lot of Americans who have greater trust in Pfizer right now than in the FDA. And there's a particular advantage to having vaccine manufacturers that have lots of other products on the market who have some reputational stake in this. So one of the vaccines in the United States is being developed by Johnson & Johnson, one of the largest pharmaceutical company in the United States. There's a concern that if the FDA says the vaccine is safe, well, the FDA is doing that to goose up President Trump's chances in early November. I'm not saying that that is the case, but that is a concern that many Americans, I think, share. Johnson & Johnson wants you to continue buying Band-Aids, right? Which is a product that they make. And they know that if they lose their credibility here, that's going to affect their other $100 billion portfolio of products. So you might say that pharma conglomerates have a particular advantage when it comes to credibility as to safety, because they do have skin in the game, and they have skin in the game that doesn't entirely depend upon what happens on the first Tuesday in November.
Okay, great. So next, may I invite Asif Kamel? Yep, Asif, please. Asif, yeah. So please raise your hand and we will put you in the queue, okay? But let's see, Asif, okay, so you'll need, let's see.
Okay. Hi, Tian, can I jump in? This is Omri.
Yes, yes, Omri, please, yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. One of the questions that has been troubling me as I followed the development of a vaccine is how many players are basically all participating in a race and maybe to a large extent replicating each other's work. Have you had any thought on how collaboration in research can be promoted by a legal regime?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't have a perfect response. But here are a few micro responses. One is that when we look at the vaccine technologies across firms, they actually vary quite a bit. So AstraZeneca is focusing on essentially using a monkey virus as its vaccine platform, whereas BioNTech and Moderna are both using this messenger RNA technology. And there are 3 or 4 other approaches to developing the vaccine. So you've got 9 or 10 companies leading this race, but they're not all doing the same thing. They're actually taking different routes through the wilderness. Second, as Coase taught us, not Coase 1960, but Coase's work in the 1930s, the boundaries of the firm are elastic, right? And the firm might expand or contract or create joint ventures in order to achieve the collaboration benefits that you described. And we've seen some of that in this context. Moderna is unusual in that it's an mRNA-focused company. It doesn't have any other product on the market, and it hasn't linked up with a major pharmaceutical company. But it has actually collaborated significantly with the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases in the United States on vaccine development, with Anthony Fauci's section of the NIH. So we've seen public sector, private sector collaboration in that context. In the Oxford context, Oxford paired up with AstraZeneca to develop its vaccine. Johnson & Johnson bought a vaccine manufacturer. BioNTech in Germany, as I mentioned, linked up with Pfizer at the very beginning of the pandemic. So we've seen a lot of that just happening in the market or between the market and the public sector. And it's not clear that we need an additional policy intervention in order to bring that about. And then the last point is this. In discussions of patents, one concern is that patent law leads to unproductive competition and unwillingness to share. And interestingly, Well, we know that from academia. We also see that in non-patent contexts, right? We see races to be the first person to submit your manuscript on a particular subject to the Journal of Legal Studies when you know that someone else might be about to preempt you. In the polio context, I think we can learn a lot about COVID-19 from polio. We had a race for a vaccine. And Salk and Sabin, neither of them had a patent-protected vaccine. Patents had nothing to do with it. Salk famously said you can't patent the sun when explaining why he didn't have a polio vaccine. Frankly, his vaccine probably wouldn't have been patentable under IP law at the time. But he and Sabin were in this competition, and they were constantly undermining each other, not because they were looking for market rewards, but because they were looking for rewards from the academy. So we will have, I think, trouble when competition overshadows collaboration in the development of a vaccine. It's not entirely clear to me that eliminating patents is going to be what saves us from that.
Good. Okay, so our next question is from Anna. So Anna, please.
Hello. I wanted to ask, since China already has some vaccines ready, do you believe that the world would accept the vaccine coming from China or otherwise manufactured in China? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in the United States, there are a number of institutions that serve as gatekeepers to the vaccine market. And if those gatekeepers say this works and it's safe, then the fact that the vaccine comes from China, I don't think is going to be the rate limiting factor. Teenagers in the United States are plenty willing to use TikTok because, much to our president's chagrin, because it works well and it's fun. So I think what really matters is those gatekeepers. Who are those gatekeepers? Well, one is the FDA, but another, and I think a particularly important gatekeeper, is our medical journals, the Journal of the American Medical Association and the New England Journal of Medicine. In the Moderna vaccine context, there was actually a big conflict between Moderna and the government researchers in Fauci's agency when they had results from their initial trial. And Moderna wanted to go straight to its investors and say, here are our results. And the government people said, no, we don't want to reveal it to investors because we want to get a publication from the New England Journal of Medicine out of this. And the New England Journal of Medicine won't publish research that's been previously disclosed elsewhere. So ultimately, a little bit of information got out to the investors, but the paper ended up in the New England Journal of Medicine. Right? And it was kind of taken as true by most of the American medical community. I think if there's a controlled trial using a Chinese-produced vaccine that's published in the New England Journal of Medicine with robust results, American vaccine nationalism or American nationalism in general will cede to our desire to end this pandemic quickly.
So may I take this opportunity to ask another question? This is related to Omri's question. So there's a horse race on vaccine, we all know. And then because the reward is exposed, then the first who developed the vaccine gets the largest reward. So my question is, how about the second and the third? Is it really a winner takes all game? You mentioned in your lecture that there will be multiple winners, and because the demand greatly exceeds supply. So my question is how to ensure there's an adequate reward for the followers. Yes.
Great. So it's a wonderful question. The challenges of going from producing 0 of these vaccines to producing 300 million vaccines in the United States are extraordinary. And in the context of a messenger RNA vaccine, freezer technology will be really important, right? We need to keep these vaccines at a particular temperature as they reach in the United States, Walgreens or CVS or Boots in England or your local drugstore where you get it or your clinic. And that means that one factory in Massachusetts is just not going to do it, right? So you'll have, in the US alone, probably, if mRNA technology turns out to be the winning technology and Pfizer and Moderna both figure out how to do this, they'll both have some market share, right? And then you've got the whole rest of the world. So my guess is whoever doesn't win the race in the United States or whoever doesn't win the race in the EU will find markets in Hong Kong and Taiwan and Singapore. So there are a lot of people who are willing to pay right now. I guess there is the concern that at the end of a pandemic, investment in technology that could help us a lot in the next pandemic will fall off. So one reason why vaccine technology investment, I think, was insufficient prior to this pandemic was a whole bunch of people tried to develop vaccines for SARS and MERS. They got pretty far along, and then the funding continued to dry up. The funding dried up as the pandemic died out. We want to sustain funding at the tail end of this pandemic for improvements on vaccine technology, perhaps a vaccine that doesn't require 2 doses 28 days apart, which will speed up not only vaccinating people the next time, but testing to develop the vaccine the next time around. How are we going to do that? And I think one way that we do that is by demonstrating that if you have the vaccine that reaches market first, we're going to reward you handsomely whenever that pandemic arrives. Another is if we can overcome the political economy challenge, then we can have public sector support for that sort of work.
Great. Okay, I can see we may have time left for 1 or 2 questions. I can see, Anna, you have another question? So, Anna?
Yes, just one. Since there are more competitors all competing for the right to basically sell this vaccine, which in turn would bring a great profit. But there is the problem. Okay, so once the winner will be decided, the one that will take most of the shares, if you can think about it, what would happen to the other companies, the ones that invested large amounts of money into this vaccine? How large or how powerful would be the hit that they would receive economically because of this vaccine? Thank you.
Great. It's a great question. So one, I'm not convinced yet that there will be people who develop a vaccine that works and they won't be able to find a market. I think at least for the next few years, as we slowly vaccinate the world, there will be a market. But there will be some of the entrants into this race who produce vaccines that don't work. And what happens to them? And then we get to, that's going to be really firm specific. So in the Moderna context, if mRNA technology doesn't work, the firm is going to fall apart. This isn't going to be a huge economic displacement. It's about 1,000 employees in the Boston area. That's the number of people that are working on our top vaccine candidate. And that includes everyone at the firm. That includes their custodian. That includes their receptionist. So yeah, they'll fail just as Netscape ultimately failed. For the big guys, for Johnson & Johnson, the cost of vaccine development is maybe 1% of market cap, maybe less. So the CEO will probably have one bad quarterly phone call with investors, and that will be about it. I think it's we've got trillions of dollars of pharma market cap in the United States, and Moderna, our leading candidate right now, spent a total of $1.6 billion on development from 2011 to 2020. So just in terms of magnitude, this is a hit that either the government or pharma can take relatively easily. In the Johnson & Johnson context, Johnson & Johnson has been saying that it would actually distribute its vaccine at cost. And one way of understanding its incentives is a COVID-19 vaccine for Johnson & Johnson is really a loss leader to get you to buy more Band-Aids and other Johnson & Johnson products that fill every American household.
Great. I think our time is almost up. So I wish to thank Hemel, Professor Hemel, for this wonderful sharing on this fascinating topic. So we know that this vaccine issue provides opportunities for our law and economics scholars to rethink the limitations of the existing patent system and the policy options available to solve this incompatibility. So I want to also take this opportunity to forecast on the next global lecture series. This is by Professor Lee Fennell on the coordinating behaviors through law and norms, COVID-19, climate change, and beyond. It will be held this Thursday, September 17th. So if no more questions, so thank you. Thanks, Professor Hemel. Thanks, Omri. And thanks all the audience for your time. So that nicely concludes today's session. Thank you.